Hi, everyone. I hope you all had a good weekend if you're watching this early in the week. If you are watching it later in the week, I hope you're having a great week. I have a quick announcement to make about the note sheet activities, the note sheets that you turn in every week on Canvas. From now on, I will not accept note sheets that are from material other than the lecture videos. So what I would like you to do every week when you watch the lecture material is to leave about a quarter of the top of your page open. So start your notes about a quarter of the way down your page. Leave that top section to answer any of the pause and reflect questions. I want to see that you guys are engaging with the material by answering those questions while you watch the videos. So if you do not have these questions answered in an obvious place on your note sheets when you turn them in, you will not get credit for your notes. Thank you for your understanding as I figure out the best way to structure this class and its assignments. I hope you find Demand Week somewhat interesting, and we will see you, well, we'll see you now in this lecture and the next lecture. Thank you. All right, folks, welcome to Demand Week. In this lecture today, we are going to discuss some definitions around demand, demand schedules, and demand curves, so how we represent demand, how to graph and read demand curves, the law of demand, we'll define the law of demand. We'll talk about the slope of demand curves and why it is the way it is. And then lastly, we'll talk about shifting the demand curves, the things that cause demand curves to shift. So first off, here's some definitions. So demand. Demand is pretty simple. It's the amount of a good or service, the number of units of a good or service consumers are willing and able to purchase at each price. Price is defined as what a buyer pays per unit of that specific good or service. And the quantity demanded is the total number of units of a good or service that consumers collectively, meaning the whole market, not each individual consumers, the number of units of a good or service that consumers as a market are willing to purchase at a specific price. So let's stop and reflect really quick. What do you guys think is going to happen if a price of a good goes up? What happens to the quantity demanded? And what happens to the quantity demanded if the price of a good goes down? So go ahead and pause the video and make a little note on your note papers there. What happens if the price of the good goes up? And what happens if the price of the good goes down? Right, so what you probably answered is that if a good gets more expensive, if the price goes up, then the demand will go down, right? If price increases, you're going to be less likely to purchase an item. If the price decreases, then demand goes up. You're more likely to purchase an item if it's cheaper. So that whole idea that you know intuitively, that whole idea is the law of demand. The law of demand says that if you keep all other variables that affect demand constant, price goes up, quantity demanded goes down. Price goes down, quantity demanded goes up. That's the law of demand. So let's talk about demand schedules and demand curves. Demand schedules are a table that shows a range of prices for a good or service, and then the quantity demanded at each of those prices. This is like the raw data. So if we were to go out and collect data on what people or how many of something people are willing to buy at each price, this is how we would organize the data. We'd organize it in a demand schedule. We have price on the left-hand column, and that's in this case in dollars per hour. And we have quantity on the right-hand column. So If we set our price at $12 an hour, we will sell 18 hours of whatever good this is. I think our graph over here is for babysitting services. So at $12 an hour, Jane, who is the babysitter, will sell $18, 18 hours of her babysitting service. So a demand curve is then the graphical representation of this demand schedule information. It's the graphical representation of that information. And you end up with a line or a curve. Here, if you graph all this data on the demand schedule, each of these being a point, then you end up with this demand curve. The demand curve shows you the relationship between price and quantity of a good or service. So if we think about graphing, like we did in our graphing lecture, this point here, 1812, this is going to be this first point here. And you'll notice that I have the numbers swapped here as to what they're reported over here in the demand schedule. So in the demand schedule, we typically report the price in the left-hand column, the quantity in the right-hand column. When you convert that into a graphed point, because remember we have quantity on our x-axis, we always represent our points as being x, comma, y. So quantity will be our x value. We're going to say 18, comma, 12. It's the same thing for all these points. For here at $9, our point on our graph will be 25. That's our quantity, 25, comma, 9. So each of these lines here, oops, go back. Each of these lines here, this line correlates to this point, this first point. This second line, $11, the quantity of 19, this is this point. So each of these lines represents a point on our demand curve. So that's the demand curve. So let's talk a little bit more about graphing the demand curve. The points on a demand schedule are graphed, and the line connecting them is the demand curve, just like we saw on that other graph. So this one is, it looks like the quantity of gasoline that we sell at different prices. So the same thing, this first point, this is if we set the highest price at $2.20 per gallon. Isn't that funny? This must be pretty old. That's the highest price. And at that price, we would sell 420 million gallons. We come down here, that's about 420 million gallons. So this negative slope, the fact that price and quantity are indirectly related, as one goes up, the other goes down, and vice versa, that creates this negative slope, and that illustrates the law of demand. Price goes up, quantity goes down, price goes down, quantity goes up. It's the law of demand in the negative slope. So why does this curve slope down? Not just because we know intuitively that it's an indirect relationship between price and quantity, but why is that? One reason is diminishing marginal utility. We talked about that last week. As consumers consume more of a product, the marginal utility, the utility of each additional unit goes down. So they're willing to pay less for more items. The other two reasons are because of the substitution effect and the income effect. Let's talk about those. So the substitution effect. So imagine that you are in the grocery store, you're there to buy, let's say, oat milk, and there's a typical brand, say you mostly buy Oatly oat milk, and you go to reach for it, and then you see right next to it, Chobani oat milk is on sale for half price. It's now cheaper than the Oatly oat milk. That change in price is probably going to affect which of those oat milks you buy, unless you feel some really serious brand loyalty to Oatly, you'll probably buy the Chobani. That's the substitution effect. Changes in price motivate consumers to buy relatively cheaper substitutes So if you compare these two oat milks and you think, well, the benefit I get from either of these is basically the same, but one is cheaper, you'll probably buy the cheaper one. So a substitute is something that can be used in place of another thing. So we think about this in terms of other products. If you're looking for a truck, a Ford 150, F-150 is roughly equivalent to a Dodge Ram. Those two products do the same thing, so they're substitutes. Oat milk versus soy milk, those two things are substitutes. They're both alternative milks. If you are a farmer and you need to bring in compost to improve the nutritional qualities of your soil and grow more crops, you may be deciding between chicken manure compost and dairy manure compost. We're going to call those substitutes. They can be used in place of one another. Their prices are different, so their demands may be different. So what are some substitutes for soda? What are substitutes for soda? I would say juice or bubbly water or milk or plain water, whatever you want to drink. Those are all substitutes for soda. There's pretty much substitutes for almost every good out there. Okay, the other thing that causes the demand curve to slope downward is what we call the income effect. Oh, actually, one more thing I want to mention about the substitution effect. Let's connect this to the downward slope of the demand curve. So because someone can usually substitute a cheaper product for any other product, that drives the price down. So if we shift the price down, consumers will buy more of that thing. So if you can substitute something for a similar product that is cheaper, you'll probably buy less of it. So the demand curve goes down. Okay, back to income effect. The income effect says that changes in price affect the purchasing power of consumers' income. This is something that we all kind of know intuitively. If there is a change in price, it affects how much you can buy with your income or your disposable income, right? If, say, everything gets more expensive, the purchasing power of your income, what your income can buy, goes down. So each dollar that you spend gets you more of a specific good if that price of the good is lower. So we tend to buy more. And we see the opposite of this with inflated prices. So if the price of something goes up and your income doesn't go up, your dollar doesn't go as far, and you're probably not going to buy as much. So in terms of the demand curve sloping down, you're making decisions based on the purchasing power of your income. And if that doesn't change, you will buy less of a good that's more expensive and more of a good that is less expensive. It's the law of demand, right? Law of demand. So demand curves don't stay in the same place. They don't stay constant all the time. In fact, they're always kind of shifting around. And they shift around because events that are separate from price, so events outside of price, happen and they shift the demand curve. So let's talk about this example of a decrease in demand. Let's say that this chart represents, it's the demand curve for almond milk. And an article comes out in the New York Times that says that almond milk is unhealthy for people and it's bad for the environment. Consumers may act on this, and their actions cause the demand curve to shift. In this case, consumers are probably going to start buying less almond milk, and that's going to cause the demand shift to, or the demand curve to shift toward what we call the origin. The origin is the 0, 0 point on the graph. It's where the y-axis and the x-axis meet. The 0, 0 point, the origin. Our demand curve, if demand decreases, the curve shifts toward the origin. So it goes from this solid line to where this dotted line is. That's the demand shift, or the shift in the demand curve. Well, let's look more into this because there's lots of things that can shift demand. One is changes in tastes and preferences, cultural changes, and we'll talk a lot more about this because this is pretty interesting. The number of consumers in a market can shift demand. The price of related goods, we already talked about substitutes. We'll also talk about complements. Income, how incomes change shifts demand, right? If you start making more money, you'll probably buy more stuff. Expectations shift demand. You can really feel this right now in this time where there's a lot of economic uncertainty. People aren't really sure with the dramatic and rapid changes in our current administration's policies, economic policies. It's creating a lot of uncertainty among consumers. So our expectations can shift the amount of stuff that we demand. And then finally, advertising and trends, which kind of goes along with the changes in taste and preferences. Advertising and trends can shift demand. So let's look at changes in tastes and preferences. What specific things do consumers like or dislike? That changes all the time, right? We know that there's different trends in the marketplaces that influence us to buy one thing over another. When I was a kid, Converse shoes were really coming back and they were super trendy. So all of the kids wanted Converse shoes, and the year before that, nobody even knew what Converse were. Taste and preferences, we could have general attitudes towards health and nutrition. You probably have noticed that health foods are becoming more and more popular. People are becoming more aware of how what they eat affects their health. They're becoming more invested in their nutrition, and therefore demand for foods that are perceived as healthier has gone up. You have food safety that can change consumers' preferences. So, every few years there's some, or probably every year, there's some like big outbreak in a foodborne illness that's associated with a certain food. So a while ago, there was an E. coli outbreak in spinach, and that really decreased the demand for spinach. Even the demand for companies like certain spinach producers who were not associated with that outbreak. The outbreak was associated with a certain producer of spinach, but the demand for all spinach went down because people were afraid of consuming tainted spinach and getting E. coli. So food safety issues change our demand, even for products that probably don't have a food safety issue, if they're associated with a product that does. Now, what about lifestyle? I find this really, really interesting because it kind of comes at the intersection of personal identity and consumption choices. So a good place to look at this is in the athletic foods industry. If you're an athlete and you're going to the gym all the time, you might be consuming some of these items. It's like athletic greens. It's supposed to be a really good micronutrient supplement. All the micronutrients that you get from plant foods, you can now consume in a powder. Muscle milk, protein, right? You need protein if you're going to work out. Nutrition bars that are formulated for athletes, power bars, scratch bars, Cliff bars, whatever. Those are products that are consumed by athletes for practical reasons. Yes, if you're going to go lift weights, you should probably consume at least 20 grams of protein afterward. So you might get that from your muscle milk. So there's a practical reason, but there's also an image reason, a lifestyle image reason. If you really identify as an athlete, that's your identity, you're more likely to consume these foods, even if maybe you don't need them for performance. And there's lots of different ways that you could look at this. You could look at it culturally too, like your ethnic culture. But let's talk about advertising and social media. So this is one that a lot of people, especially young people, are really aware of, especially in the age of social media that we're in. So I'm not really on social media very much, but all my stepdaughters are. And they tell me about these trends, particularly on TikTok, um, that have changed the demand for certain items. So apparently, a while ago, some TikTok influencer person discovered Dubai chocolate. I have no idea where this came from, but they discovered Dubai chocolate over here. And they made a TikTok, I don't know, do you call it a reel? Something, whatever you call it, a reel. Um, they created a reel in which they ate some Dubai chocolate and they talked about how delicious and amazing it was. And that has increased the demand for Dubai chocolate. And now you can find Dubai chocolate. I saw it at New Leaf the other day at the checkout line. Whereas, a few months ago, nobody knew what this stuff was. So social media is a really powerful tool for changing demand. Um, Advertising, there's a whole bunch of advertising campaigns, many of which are pretty silly when you really think hard about it. Um, like, does buying a Jeep make you more of a badass driver, like they kind of show in the commercials? Probably not. But they really can change demand. So Burger King got this idea that consumers are they're concerned about the presence of artificial preservatives in their fast food. And Burger King launched this advertising campaign to show to consumers that their product is kind of a healthier fast food because it doesn't have these artificial preservatives that are present in other fast foods. They decided to show this by leaving a Whopper out on a counter, presumably in the Burger King headquarters lab. They left it out for, I don't know, a month or something like that. And they took pictures of it every day. And then they created these ads. This is day 28 of a Whopper being left out on a counter. It's all moldy and gross. And they say, this is beautiful. This is beautiful because there are no artificial preservatives. This is what happens. We're going to prove to you that we don't use these artificial preservatives. Um, these advertisements, as like gross as it might look, these were really powerful. And there's a very successful advertising campaign. Burger King sales went up due to this campaign. So tastes and preferences can change according to lots of different things, advertising and social media, lifestyle, food safety, all of these things. It can change and it shifts the demand curve whenever they change. So take a second to pause and reflect. Pause the video and ask yourself, what's a product that you've seen on social media or some other form of advertising that you've noticed has become more popular lately? This could be a food product, it could be a type of clothing, it could be a car, it could be whatever. Stanley cups is one, those like Stanley cups, the insulated cups that everyone's carrying around now. Think of something like that and make a note of it on your note paper. Go ahead and pause the video now and do that. Okay, so the next factor that can change demand is the number of consumers that you have. So how many people purchase this good changes the price. If you have lots and lots and lots of consumers who are interested in a product, then you may start mass producing the product. You may start mass producing it. When you mass produce something, typically the price of producing each good goes down. So if the price of producing it goes down, then the producer can sell it for less. So it changes the price. If you have a good that, maybe it's a real specialty good, it only appeals to a certain subset of people, then you may not mass produce. So in general, if you have more consumers, that means your demand is greater. So if you're creating a product that appeals to more consumers and not just people who are interested in a specific niche, you will have a greater demand. So then the price of related goods also affects the demand curve. We already talked about substitutes. Substitutes are two goods that could be used interchangeably. They could be used in place of one another. That could be like cow's milk and almond milk. It could be a John Deere tractor versus a Kubota tractor. Those are two different brands or makers. But let's talk about this example of plastic produce boxes versus waxed cardboard produce boxes. So if you're a farm producing vegetables, you are probably going to be purchasing cardboard produce boxes or plastic produce boxes. And these are boxes that produce gets packed in order to be shipped to the wholesaler or the restaurant or grocery store, wherever you're selling them. You're going to be packing your produce in these boxes. Cardboard boxes are traditionally cheaper. So many places use a cardboard box that is waxed to prevent it falling apart when it gets wet. If the price of its substitute of plastic produce boxes changes, if the price of plastic produce boxes for some reason goes way down, farmers might start switching to using the plastic produce boxes. And them switching to the plastic is going to cause the demand curve for the cardboard boxes to go down. So the demand curve will shift inward toward that origin point that we talked about. The demand curve for the plastic produce boxes, however, will shift outward away from the origin point. So that's how substitutes work as far as the demand curve goes. Generally, if the price of a substitute goes down, the demand for the original product will also go down. So complements. Complements are different than substitutes in that they are two goods that are usually used together. So an example of that would be hot dogs and hot dog buns. Not very many people are going to the store to buy hot dog buns so they can make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich with them. They're buying hot dog buns to use them with hot dogs. So those two goods are complements. An ag example could be if you are a farm that is producing your own seedlings to plant out into your field, you're probably purchasing these plastic seedling trays here. And you also have to purchase a seed starter mix, a soil mix that is formulated just for starting seeds. So these two goods are complements. They go together. Another example from the ag industry could be traditional wine bottles and corks. So if you have traditional wine bottles, you're going to use a cork with it to stop the bottle, right? You put a cork in the end to close the bottle versus like a bottle that has a twist off cap. That's a different kind of bottle, right? The bottle has to be threaded to take the cap. So the complements would be traditional wine bottles and corks, or the threaded wine bottles and the twist-on caps. So if you have an increase in price of a complement to a good, say that corks get really expensive. Corks are really expensive. People are probably going to buy less corks than use less corks. Therefore, the demand for the complement of that good, the demand for the traditional wine bottles goes down, right? If you're not going to use corks anymore, you're going to be buying less traditional wine bottles. Now, that may shift to then people purchasing and using the substitute for traditional wine bottles and corks. The substitute would be the threaded wine bottles and the twist-on caps. So the demand for threaded wine bottles goes up. The demand for traditional wine bottles goes down. So the demand for corks and the demand for traditional bottles is direct. As the demand for corks goes down, the demand for traditional bottles goes down. The relationship between the twist-on caps and the threaded wine bottles is also direct. Those two things, as the demand for threaded bottles goes up, the demand for the caps that go with them also goes up. And then the relationship between the two types of systems, the traditional wine bottles versus the threaded wine bottles, that relationship is indirect. As one goes up, the other goes down, and vice versa. So that's how the price of related goods affects the demand curve. Now, income. When your income changes, it affects how much of a good you buy, which is what we've been talking about, but it also affects what kinds of goods you buy. So As your income increases, people are generally able to purchase more goods and services, and they're generally able to purchase better goods and services. So if you're a poor college student and you're eating cup of noodles every night, we're going to call cup of noodles an inferior good as compared to, say, takeout chow mein from a nice Chinese restaurant. Our takeout chow mein is our normal good. Cup of noodles, inferior good. Normal good, the nice takeout chow mein. So the relationship between income and normal goods, the demand for normal goods, is directly related. It's this blue line. As your income goes up, your demand for normal goods also goes up. Direct relationship, right? So the demand for the normal good will go up as income goes up. Inferior goods, which is this orange line, as your income goes up, generally you're consuming less cup of noodles and more of the nice tasty chow mein. So the demand for inferior goods is actually a negative slope when you're looking at the demand in terms of income, not in terms of price, but in terms of income. So if your income goes up, you demand less inferior goods. You shift the demand curve for inferior goods down, and you shift the demand for normal goods up. Now, your expectations. When you expect a change in a price, it affects your demand for that product now. If you think that gas prices are going to go up next week, you might choose to fill your tank up this week versus waiting until next week when things are higher. So your demand for gas is higher now. You've shifted the demand curve out now. So vice versa, if you think that your favorite clothing store is going to have a sale next week, you're probably going to wait to buy new clothes until that sale happens. When you anticipate a better deal next week, your demand for those new clothes this week goes down. So the shift in demand can be temporal. It can be related to time as well. So that's all I've got on demand curves. So what we learned about was some definitions. We learned about the law of demand. As price goes up, quantity demanded goes down, and vice versa. We learned about some things that shift the demand curve, and we learned about why the demand curve has a negative slope. So that is it for this lecture.